On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the World Trade Organization in crisis with a paralyzed dispute settlement system. A former appellate body chair gives her 2 cents on how to keep the multilateral trading system working. And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. The WTO Appellate Body is facing its first lockout crisis in nearly 25 years. The body, the de facto WTO court of the last resort, is unable to hear any new cases because it has only 1 judge left starting Wednesday. The U.S. has blocked the selection process for new judges. Other WTO members are making a last-ditch effort to find a solution, but really, can they? Let's take a look at the latest development.
Global free trade is facing an unprecedented crisis with the loss of an independent referee, the World Trade Organization Appellate Body. The dispute settlement panel has, over the past 25 years, arbitrated international trade cases. But the de facto Supreme Court of World Trade is now paralyzed because it does not have enough judges beginning Wednesday.
There is no doubt in anybody's mind that the dispute settlement system has been compromised, and that we now live in a moment of uncertainty with regard to disputes that are ongoing. Now, having said that, like I pointed out before, it doesn't mean that there are no alternatives. There are many uncertainties.
As the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, the appellate body has 7 judges. At least 3 members are needed to hear an appeal. The terms of the 2 of the last 3 judges ended on Tuesday. Since 2017, the U.S. has blocked the selection process for new judges, citing so-called systemic problems. A draft plan to reform the body agreed on by WTO members through months of discussion failed to pass without U.S. support at the 5th meeting of the General Council this week. Zhang Shangchen, China's ambassador to the WTO, said in a statement that he was marking the occasion by wearing the black tie his wife had given him for funerals. Zhang said a moribund WTO dispute settlement system is no doubt the most severe blow to the multilateral trading system since its establishment. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said China was working with other members to search for an interim plan to handle WTO dispute cases while the appellate body is out of commission. Zhang Yuejiao, a former chair of the appellate body, wrote a letter to her colleagues on the last working day of the panel, saying she felt so bad and with tears for the collapse of the AB. But she believed the AB will come back. The WTO will never die. Meanwhile, the European Union said it could impose tariffs on the U.S. and other trading partners if they refuse to settle disputes after the crippling of the appellate body. The EU is still awaiting panel rulings on trade cases.
We stimulate and urge members to try to find negotiated and mutually acceptable solutions before introducing any kind of trade restrictive measures, because that simply compromises the environment of the global economy.
With the WTO dispute settlement system in tatters, many are worried that the global trading system may revert to the law of the jungle, with smaller nations powerless against trade giants.
After a wrap-up of the latest situation, let's see an important interview. On the last working day of the WTO Appellate Body, Zhang Yuejiao, the former chair of the dispute settlement panel of the World Trade Organization, wrote an open letter to her colleagues. She started the letter with one sentence: a sad day. But she also advised them to be firm in their belief in the rule of law. Here's the first part of my exclusive interview with Professor Zhang Yuejiao, who's had an extraordinary career as a dispute settlement judge. Let's listen in. For more with us here in Beijing, Zhang Yuejiao, the former chair of the WTO Appellate Body, who's also a professor and dean of the Institute for International Dispute Settlement at Tsinghua University here in China. Professor Zhang, what a pleasure to have you here.
Very pleased to meet you. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Everybody read your letter. It was a very touching letter. After the U.S. blocked the new candidate for the appellate body, which makes the institution paralyzed. Now, Professor Zhang, tell us more about what you've been interacting with your colleagues or former colleagues.
Yeah, we have been very worried about the current situation because the AB has been done extremely well and outstanding job, the most successful function of the WTO, and it's also called that the crown jewel. But unfortunately, that they are facing a political crisis for the last 2 years because one member just has stopped the selection process. As you know, the appellate body is the highest body for the dispute settlement of the WTO. And WTO dispute settlement is the central element for ensuring predictability and security of the rule-based multilateral trading system. Very, very important. And since the establishment of the WTO, already 25 years, and the WTO, the appellate body has about more than 20 judges, and they have done outstanding work and issued about 100 appellate body reports. And to settle disputes among the WTO members, 164 members, is an outstanding job and it's a very important element of the rule of law.
I know you have been keeping close contact with your former colleague who worked still at the appellate body before it collapsed. Now, how do you think you guys will be encouraging to one another to wait for the comeback of the AB, as you say?
I would say that I'm very encouraged by my former appellate body colleagues. Once I sent my letter in the very early morning of 10 December, and then immediately they sent reply to my letter, and they fully agree with what I said, and they are very confident. They said, don't give up. We need to move forward. We need to bring the AB back.
So now when the United States blocked it, I just wonder what is your reaction to that? Because apparently the people who used to work with you now have to be waiting for their job to come back. What does that mean?
Certainly, my former colleagues, we worked together for so many years. For myself, more than 8 years in Geneva at the WTO, days and nights, including weekends. What we are looking for is the best quality and justice of the case, objective assessment. So once, you know, the number of cases is increasing, and we need more people, more judges. At that critical moment, one member just blocked the selection process. You can imagine what we feel. We feel very bad because we know that we need at least 7 judges to fulfill their mission with so many cases on the table. And we need to consider also the concern of members, because when they bring their cases, show their trust and confidence on the system. If we cannot deliver on time, then that we will make very bad image on the WTO dispute settlement. So we do everything possible because we all know that the appeal system is needed not only for the WTO but also for other international dispute settlements such as international investment dispute and antitrust. They had produced a wonderful report, working group report, that after their careful studies with more than 100 countries' views and experience, that a system of correction is needed. Appeal system is desirable and feasible.
Now, earlier there were proposals about the so-called reform of the appellate body that has been put forward by the relevant parties. However, the country that we mentioned earlier did not agree even on those reform plans of the appellate body in order to start again the institution. So what do you think will be the next step, really, Professor Zhang? Will this deadlock continue?
After I sent my letter to my former colleagues and the secretary staff, friends, they all gave me very good feedback. And particularly, I'm very encouraged by my former appellate body colleagues. They all support my attitude and to work forward, to push the system to resume the selection process, and we are confident that the appellate body should come back. We were encouraged by 127 members. They sent several times their letter, their application for the resumption of the selection process. So the majority, overwhelming majority.
If you had an opportunity, if you had an opportunity to face the president of that specific country, after all, it's believed that the administration have taken on an unusual road so far. So what would you say to him?
I would say that the rule of law is recognized by all, and the WTO covered agreements joined, recognized, ratified by all members. That's their international obligations, international commitment. In international law, there's an important thing is a pacta sunt servanda. It means that every country should observe and fulfill its obligations in its international commitments. So international law is very, very important. Now, I think we need to call people to come back. Once you join, you don't need to give another concern. It means that you obey automatically all provisions.
So you want them to come back, that's what you're going to say?
Yes.
That's the first part of my exclusive interview with Zhang Yuejiao, the former chair of the WTO Appellate Body. We're going to continue to play that interview later in our program. Up next, we'll ask our panelists coming from Europe, the U.S., and China how WTO members will do in the face of a paralyzed trade dispute settlement mechanism right after this break. Welcome back. You are watching World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. Let's continue our discussion about the collapse of the appellate body so far. What does it mean for everyone, and what does it mean for the WTO as well? In Brussels, we're joined by Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, a managing partner at One Partner, and with us in our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. So, what options do we have now, Mr. Cameron?
First option's the law of the jungle, which I don't think is going to suit anyone, in the end, not even Mr. Trump. But the second option, which the EU is pushing, is to get a group of like-minded countries including China, Canada, Norway, Australia, Japan, to actually agree to an interim solution, which basically keeps a judicial system. And this is provided for under Article 25 of the WTO rules. The Director General can simply set up a group of judges to hear a case and roughly go through the same procedure as we are today. So that's a good interim solution, but of course we do need a long-term solution with the United States on board. But of course that depends very much on the Trump administration changing their view on the WTO.
Is a long-term solution any possibility at the end of the tunnel, Mr. Pruitt?
Well, I would be very doubtful under this administration that that's going to occur. I think this administration really doesn't have a long-term plan for any of the trade activities. They would argue, of course, they do, but because they're so transactional in nature, they're basically just trying to get through the current storm that is swirling around U.S.-China trade, U.S.-EU engagement, and other engagements around the world. As you may well know, just yesterday there was an announcement of an agreement on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. And that fits, quite frankly, into the Trump model of being able to put a win on the calendar here as an indication of his success. So I don't expect anything long-term. I do expect that the other countries will move very aggressively, as they should, to find an alternative means of dealing with the broader issues.
Well, the coalition of the willing, so-called, whether that option is an option, Professor Liu, from China's perspective?
I think it's really viable because WTO per se is really a voluntary agreement that really based on consensus. So therefore, if one big giant member is really trying to block the road, so how can other members work if they have a common goal for a dispute settlement in a fair manner? So to do this, I think the Canada working with the EU on this one can set up a benchmark example, and if, as the previous professor said, well, if we can like-minded countries can really join and rebuild at least a portion of the platform, so WTO is not really being threatened to paralyze.
I see. So there are a lot of ifs, gentlemen, I noticed in your answers, but the question really is, what is next? The question people asked about what is next is not just about the appellate body, but also what is next for WTO, Mr. Cameron. This World Trade Organization, a multilateral mechanism, certainly not liked by the Trump administration right now in Washington. What's likely to be its fate, beginning by looking at the fate of the appellate body?
Well, I think we've probably got 12 months left of this Trump administration. If it goes into a second Trump administration and that administration continues its ideological hostility to the WTO, then I think it's, pretty serious indeed. But we can limp along for another 12 months using an interim solution, hoping that there's a new administration or a change of heart in Washington. We shall see. But at the moment, it does not look very good.
But really, Mr. Liu, what Mr. Cameron just mentioned is that at least we'll have 1 year when 25% of the global GDP, in the words of the former Director General of the WTO, Mr. Pascal Lamy, is taking hostage of this 75% of the global GDP when it comes to trade, Professor Liu.
Of course,
what do you mean by of course? Is it a fact that we have to accept to a certain extent?
This is really a serious issue. I mean, so the WTO is elaborated, and it's particularly in the dispute settlement mechanism is there. Finally, the whole world.
Yeah. The question is, what is next?
Yeah, the question for next is one, okay, hooray, if Donald Trump do decide to withdraw from WTO, then, other members can, stick and reverse to this appellate body. And the other is, okay, you know, there's interim procedures.
Yes.
And then third can be, you know, trading blocks or even big trading partners.
But what is next is not just about the appellate body. What's next about WTO, Mr. Liu?
I think, you know, WTO is substantially discredited for its function, although the negotiation mechanism or all the other can be available. So it really is risking the further fragmentation, particularly in recent decade where regional trade agreements are there to supersede, although it's really being accommodated by WTO. So I would say that RTO, or regional trade agreements, are taking precedence.
Okay. Mr. Puig, so rule-based international system now is not in favor of the United States? Will a change of administration really change this perception? Will they take on a different road? Should the rest of the world bet on another 12 months for the U.S. to change? Or it is really too much to hope?
Well, I have been arguing recently that all of our institutions, particularly those at the international level, are much stronger than I think many of us want to give them credit for, and that despite the turmoil that is created by a Trump administration's actions and ideology, that they are strong enough to survive this time and will go on. They've gone through numerous other administrations. The WTO, this is not the first time, nor is it the first administration that they've had issues with. So they're still around. Yes, they're going through a tough period now. But I think 12 months is, quite frankly, not an eternity.
Yeah, but you know, Mr. Puig, if I could, even inside your country, just as you beautifully put it, there is a huge division about what to do with the international mechanism, even for the advantage of the United States' interests. So do you think this divide is getting ever bigger? What does that mean also for the U.S. Future approach to international system, not just about the appellate body, not just about WTO, but about any kinds of rule-based international mechanism?
Well, I would certainly argue against that. I don't think it's getting any wider. I think it's just getting more coverage, quite frankly. Secondly, I would suggest to you that there are more, shall we say, peaceful and internationally intended minds in existence in this country than you're seeing. And they are reacting and acting internationally at a much greater level than these individual highlight situations that we can pull up. So I'm not convinced that this is widespread, and I don't believe that it will carry on and carry over to the next administration.
Now, there is an immediate question, that is what to do with international trade disputes, particularly after ruling of the ad hoc bodies. Mr. Cameron, should there be other entities, and how fast can people establish other alternatives? How authoritative will those other entities be if they ever exist? And how inclusive will they be to be able to make sure it's not going to be the rule of the jungle, at least when it comes to trade?
Well, I think what is happening now is that the major trading powers, excluding the United States, are going to use two things. One, an interim solution based on the current appellate judge approach of the WTO, as I say, proposed by the Director General. But secondly, there will be a large amount of peer pressure to actually resolve disputes bilaterally in the negotiating room. That's actually what happens at the moment. Not that many disputes end up in the DSM procedure. So I think that you will see countries now hesitating, wanting to try and do a bilateral deal on issues before they would even go to this interim solution. Nobody's going to start creating a new body from scratch because it would be simply too complicated. But if the Trump administration is re-elected and the hostility continues, that's when you might see a complete realignment.
Professor Liu, we have seen earlier, as Mr. Pruitt also mentioned, the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement, the so-called updated version of NAFTA, and also RCEP. That has been discussed so far by ASEAN countries, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand as well. India at this moment is pondering about whether to join or not. As a result of that, Japan has also been saying, well, you know, I have been not necessarily sure about that. So, Professor Liu, given all of these options regionally going on, how do you think the next stage of trade mechanism and the next stage of disputes of trade likely to be?
Well, realistically, although despite the rise of many of the regional trade agreements, the quality of those regional trade agreements can hardly compare with the multilateral system of WTO, particularly in terms of dispute settlement. So unless the situation of WTO corner those regional agreements can really work on the consensus to build the dispute settlement mechanism within themselves, or they negotiate with WTO to receive certification or ratification or approval to vest in the WTO system, it remains a gentleman agreement.
A gentleman agreement and gentleman agreement only. Mr. Cameron, agree?
Yes, I do. I think that we're not going to see a multilateral revival of the WTO anytime soon. The reality is it hasn't actually achieved much over the last couple of decades, and the trend has been, as your other colleagues have said, towards regional agreements. And within these regional and sometimes bilateral agreements, such as the EU has struck with Canada or Singapore, there is provision for dispute settlement for investors in these agreements. So I think that's the way, for the foreseeable future, international trade is likely to grow.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if I could, Mr. Cameron, people have been talking about the reform of the WTO, including the reform of the Appellate Body, but none of those has been approved or clearly studied by the party who certainly was playing a negative role in terms of making the Appellate Body's future continue. So let me ask you here, Mr. Pruitt, also about that as well. What do you think will be the potential of dispute settlement for the future as we speak? Will the U.S. need any dispute settlement anymore, or is going to just exercise its muscle and say, I'm the biggest tiger in the jungle, therefore this is the way I'm going to handle it?
Well, I think as far as the U.S. is concerned, we run the risk of overplaying our hand under the approach that the Trump administration is following. I think that as we move forward and the reality of development in the rest of the world becomes apparent, what we're going to see, again, is certainly more regional interaction. And if you look at the number and types of cases that even today are pending at the WTO, they don't involve the U.S. in many instances anyway. So when you look again at the philosophy of this administration, the multilateral agreements don't give them the big win that they need. Trump needs statistics. He needs numbers. His entire program is based around the math game and being able to say, I've got more wins than the other team. And you don't get that through multilateralism. You resolve, as you note, large global issues, but you don't get those individual wins that he can show as part of a record of achievement.
Professor Liu, will WTO seek a different road in terms of its reform? There was earlier talking about whether it should be consensus-based, which is right now the way. Everybody has to agree on certain things before it becomes the rule of the road. Or it can be Congress-based. But of course, that's a huge debate. Professor, very briefly.
You know, the reform can really be that, you know, consensus-based is good when 164 members can totally agree, but it's going to...
Congress-based.
Well, theoretically it can, but in the meantime, it's going to be even more difficult than to restore the appellate body.
Reform of the WTO, Mr. Cameron, very briefly before we go.
It's not going to happen anytime soon.
As simple as that, but certainly a very complicated situation. Thank you so much for the three of you for joining us, Professor Liu Baocheng, Mr. Steve Pruitt, and Mr. Fraser Cameron. Really appreciate it. So what's next for WTO dispute settlement? Where after our talk with these gentlemen coming from different perspectives, we're going to continue our interview with the former WTO Appellate Body Chair, Professor Zhang Yuejiao, right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. A crippling blow to the WTO's ability to settle trade disputes. Insights on the organization's trouble from the former chair of the WTO Appellate Body, Zhang Yuejiao, and our panelists earlier. So what's next for the 25-year-old multilateral trade institution? Can WTO make it without the world's largest economy? As the first Chinese judge who served on the WTO top court, Professor Zhang says she remains optimistic. Let's hear more from the one-on-one interview with her. Earlier, I had an exclusive interview with Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of WTO. Now, not serving as the chair and the Director General, he speaks his own mind. He said the world probably have to think twice, that there might be the chance that one has to function without the participation of the United States. Do you think that will be possible? Should it be done if things like this continue?
It could happen this way, but it's not desirable because as the WTO, they cover 164 members,
Yes.
And more than 98 volume of international trade. We don't want to have a member, particularly an important member, left out of the system. So it's binding on all members. It's all members' commitment. So the desirable way is still to call all members to come together. Certainly, if a WTO without one member, like a regional or big group, but still it's desirable to have a unanimous concern, the agency and the rules.
It's desirable, but sometimes it's very, very challenging. Now, Professor Zhang, many say if the appellate body paralyzed as it is today, if that situation continues particularly, it will be a domino effect for rule-based international trade system particularly. And it could also have a spillover effect to the other areas, which is based on international law and international legislation. So what do you say? Is there a potential, sad potential like that?
I see the challenges, but...
you put it in a very diplomatic way.
Now, why I'm confident? Because, you know, members, they need to think about the globalization is inevitable. It's currently happen, and also they will develop this way. And it's a win-win situation. If, for instance, we have a fragmented system, and it's bad. No winner in the fragmented system. Because globalization and international trade, we should provide a facilitation to trade, to goods, to people, and to everything, to services. So we need an investment. So we need to call the whole world. I would say that maybe temporarily they can select other ways, or regional or free trade agreements. But by the end of the day, the free trade agreements is still under Article 24 of the WTO GATT. So their final objective is to bring the regional free trade agreement into the global unified covered agreement.
What about China? You saw the Chinese ambassador Zhang Xiangchen to the WTO wore black tie when he was making a very compassionate speech after the appellate body collapsed in a way, temporarily at least. What is your reaction to that as well? I mean, you are originally coming from China, but when you're serving on the appellate body, you are not representing China, but rather representing the international law.
Yeah, you are right, because independence, impartiality is a key requirement for all international judges. We need to provide objective assessment, not linked to any government. However, as a professional, as a judge, a former judge of the WTO Appellate Body, I highly appreciate the statements made by Ambassador Zhang, because he's right that we should let the covered agreement functioning, the appellate body functioning. I highly appreciate, and his appreciation, his support to the WTO staff, to the WTO professionals. I think it's very important to keep institutional memory. It's good. It's the whole world treasury we need to protect, because in other areas we are, for instance, the exit or ancestral, they just start to consider to set up a similar appeal system. They want to learn from the WTO Appellate Body. In that sense, I'm confident the WTO, the AB will come back, and the WTO will never die.
Without AB, will WTO still be WTO anymore?
Without AB, the WTO certainly, they do have 60 covered agreements still valid, ratified by all members. So all members, they need to follow, to obey that covered agreements. I would say that certainly they need early or later the disadvantage, shortcomings of losing the appellate body, because there's a fair balance between the panel stage, automatic adoption of the panel report, and certainly since ad hoc basis, panelists, they will make some legal errors. And then a correction system by the appellate body. It's a fair balance to ensure that the interpretation and clarification and consistency of the covered agreement is good for everybody, for the world legal community. It's a contribution to the international law as well.
Lastly, before we go, may I ask you now, not only you earlier served as the chairwoman of the appellate body of WTO, you are also working on commerce dispute and investment dispute on a global basis. How is your work now interact with all of the earlier causes you've been talking about?
Because no matter commercial dispute or investment dispute or trade dispute, there are some similarities, because I believe that dispute settlement is a kind of a public goods, and to provide justice and an objective assessment and a prompt positive solution of disputes is the mandate for all arbitrators and judges. So in that sense, quite similar to each other. But they are also different, because they are dealing with different subject matters. WTO is dispute between governments on trade issues, and commercial disputes between two individuals and two companies on trade. But for investment, it's between an investor and a state on investment, legal issues arising from investment. But similarity is, I think nowadays, they should think about the shortcomings of the whole dispute settlement. It's getting longer and longer, and it's getting more expensive. So that, in that way, we should improve the system, to making the system more transparent, to making the system, the procedures, shorter and also less paper requirement.
I see.
To make their report clear, concise, and correct, to make their report reader-friendly.
These, of course, are very important tasks need to be fulfilled before we talk about the more potential of the dispute settlement and others. Thank you so much, Professor Zhang Yuezhao, former chairwoman of the WTO Appellate Body. What a pleasure. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel and Twitter and Facebook accounts. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and China.